From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
What people can and cannot do with information has more effect than ever on the exercise of power in our physical world.
Wikipedia will go dark Wednesday to protest two controversial internet anti-piracy bills moving through Congress. We'll speak with Rebecca McKinnon, author of Consent of the Networked, the worldwide struggle for internet freedom. She argues for every empowering story of the internet's role, there are many more about the quiet corrosion of civil liberties by companies and governments. Then veteran war correspondent Chris Hedges sues President Obama over the National Defense Authorization Act, which includes controversial provisions allowing the military to jail anyone, anywhere without charge or trial. But Obama has support from most of the Republican presidential candidates.
Governor Romney, as president, would you have signed the National Defense Act as written?
Yes, I would have, and I do believe that it's appropriate to have in our nation the capacity to detain people who are threats to this country.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The 5 leading Republican candidates debated in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina last night ahead of the state's closely watched primary Saturday. Republican presidential hopefuls Newt Gingrich, Rick Perry, and Rick Santorum repeatedly attacked frontrunner Mitt Romney's record in business and government. Texas Governor Rick Perry pushed Romney to open up his tax records.
Mitt, we need for you to release your income tax so the people of this country can see how you made your money.
And what's happened in history is people have released them in about April of the coming year, and that's probably what I do.
Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich defended his sharp criticism of Romney.
We need to satisfy the country that whoever we nominate has a record that can stand up to Barack Obama in a very effective way. And I think that's part of his responsibility as a candidate. And I think that's part of what a campaign is about, is to raise questions and see whether or not your competitor can answer them effectively before you get to a general election where you know those questions are going to be asked.
Mitt Romney criticized President Obama for seeking to negotiate with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
The right course for America is not to negotiate with the Taliban while the Taliban are killing our soldiers. The right course is to recognize they are the enemy of the United States. It's the vice president who said they're not the enemy of the United States. The vice president's wrong. They are the enemy. They're killing American soldiers. We don't negotiate from a position of weakness as we're pulling our troops out. The right course for us is to strengthen the Afghan military force so they can reject the Taliban.
Texas Congressmember Ron Paul reiterated his call to end the war in Afghanistan and bring the troops home.
This idea that we can't debate foreign policy, then all we have to do is start another war? I mean, it's warmongering. They're building up for another war against Iran, and people can't wait to get in another war. This country doesn't need another war. We need to quit the ones we're in. We need to save the money and bring our troops home.
Hours before the Republican debate, former Utah Governor John Huntsman dropped out of the presidential race and endorsed Mitt Romney. In other campaign news, a group of over 100 leaders of the Christian right met in Texas this weekend and voted to back former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum as their preferred candidate. Attendees of the meeting include Family Research Council President Gary Bauer, Focus on the Family founder James Dobson, and Family Research President Tony Perkins. Meanwhile, Wyoming billionaire Foster Friess has pledged to donate $500,000 to a pro-Santorum super PAC. Immigration rights groups are criticizing Mitt Romney for embracing an endorsement from Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. He helped draft an anti-immigration legislation in Arizona and Alabama. Democratic Congressmember Luis Gutierrez condemned Romney for working with Kobach, who he described as the, quote, dark lord of the anti-immigration movement. In other news, newly released government documents have revealed the Department of Homeland Security hired the military contractor General Dynamics to monitor postings of U.S. citizens on dozens of websites. Sites monitored included Facebook and Twitter, as well as several news sites, including the New York Times, Wired, and the Huffington Post. General Dynamics was asked to collect reports that dealt with government agencies, including the CIA, FEMA and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Ginger McCall of the Electronic Privacy Information Center said the documents show the Department of Homeland Security was, quote, monitoring political dissent online. The Wall Street Journal reports U.S. military leaders are increasingly concerned that Israel is preparing to attack Iran over apparent U.S. objections. According to the Journal, President Obama, Defense Secretary Panetta, and other top officials have delivered a string of private messages to Israeli leaders warning about the dire consequences of a strike. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair Martin Dempsey is set to visit Israel this week. The United States has also stepped up contingency planning to safeguard U.S. facilities in the region in case of an Israeli attack. Meanwhile, the United States and Israel have postponed what had been described as the largest joint military exercise ever carried out by the two nations. Foreign Policy magazine is reporting Israeli Mossad agents have posed as American spies to recruit members of the Pakistani militant group Jandala to carry out covert operations against Iran. According to the report, the CIA learned about the so-called false flag operation several years ago. It's unclear if the program continues. Foreign Policy magazine report was published just days after Iran accused Israel of assassinating one of its nuclear scientists. 12 people were killed Monday in Syria, despite the presence of Arab League monitors inside the country. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called on the bloodshed to end.
Today I say again to President Assad of Syria, stop the violence, stop killing your own people.
In news from Egypt, Mohammed al-Baradei has pulled out of the race for the Egyptian presidency. The former director of the International Atomic Energy Agency said the previous regime was still running the country and that he couldn't run for office unless it was within a real democratic system. The Nigerian government has announced a partial cut in gas prices following 9 days of strikes and protests backed by many of Nigeria's largest trade unions. On Monday, the Nigeria Labor Congress and the Trade Union Congress called for the strike to end, but a third organization, the Joint Action Front, said the protest should continue. Abdulwahed Omar is the president of the Nigeria Labor Congress.
In the last 24 hours, the labor movement and its allies, who had the historic responsibility of coordinating these mass actions, had cause to review the various actions and decided that in order to save lives and in the interest of national survival, these mass actions be suspended.
In other news from Nigeria, 2 oil workers are missing after an offshore oil rig owned by Chevron caught fire on Monday. In news from Latin America, retired military general Otto Perez Molina has been sworn in as Guatemala's new president. Perez is the first former military official to win the Guatemalan presidency since the end of the military dictatorship in 1986.
Everyone rise and fly the blue and white flag in our hearts and work for change. We will have security if we all work for it. We will have development if we all make an effort. We will have peace if everyone does their part. Because Guatemala belongs to all of us, regardless of social or economic conditions.
Otto Perez Molina ran for office in Guatemala largely on a platform of using an iron fist to crack down on drug cartels. On his first day in office, Perez called on the military to help, quote, neutralize organized crime in Guatemala. Perez, who was trained at the School of the Americas, is also seeking an end to a U.S. ban on military aid to Guatemala. Human rights groups have accused Perez of being directly involved in the systematic use of torture and acts of genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s. Human rights attorney Jennifer Harbury appeared on Democracy Now! Last year.
Well, we're all extremely concerned given his background in human rights violations in Guatemala. He's always declared that he was not involved in the genocidal campaign of 1982 in the Quiché Highlands, but in fact a video showing Alan Nairn interviewing him precisely as he stands over several battered corpses has been making the rounds in Guatemala. He was a major at the time, and this, of course, was the year when 70% to 90% of the villages in the Ichil Triangle were razed.
To see that full interview with Jennifer Harber, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. In other news from Central America, El Salvador's President Mauricio Funes apologized Monday for the 1981 El Mozote massacre, when U.S.-trained Salvadoran forces killed nearly 1,000 civilians. Funes described it as, quote, the worst massacre of civilians in contemporary Latin American history.
As the President of the Republic and the Commander of the Armed Forces, I ask forgiveness from the victims and the neighboring communities. Hundreds of Salvadorans, both men and women, form part of a long list of disappeared people, while others immigrated and lost everything in order to save their own lives.
The Salvadoran president made the public apology on the 20th anniversary of El Salvador's 1992 peace accords. 29 people remain missing after an Italian cruise ship ran aground Friday, killing 6 and forcing thousands to flee the sinking ship. The ship was owned by a subsidiary of the Florida-based Carnival Corporation. Italy's environment minister has warned of an ecological crisis if oil from the cruise ship spills off the island of Giglio, part of a protected sanctuary for dolphins, porpoises, and whales. Opponents of Wisconsin's Republican Governor Scott Walker say they will submit the signatures of more than 700,000 voters today seeking a recall of Walker and his Lieutenant Governor, Rebecca Kleefisch. The signature drive gathered far more than the 540,000 signatures needed to force a recall. Signatures have also been gathered to force recalls of the Wisconsin Senate Majority Leader and 3 other Republican senators. They were all backers of a bill signed into law last year, effectively ending collective bargaining rights for most public workers. In news from Arizona, school officials have released an initial list of books to be banned from the school system following last week's vote to suspend the district's acclaimed Mexican-American Studies program due to a state ban on the teaching of ethnic studies. The banned books include Rethinking Columbus, The Next 500 Years, Shakespeare's play The Tempest, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, Occupied America, A History of Chicanos by Rodolfo Cunha, and Chicano, The History of the Mexican Civil Rights Movement. Salon.com reported teachers have also been informed to stay away from any books where, quote, race, ethnicity, and oppression are central themes. The ethnic studies program that's being done away with is in Tucson, Arizona. Occupy Wall Street protesters held a number of actions across the country this weekend to mark Martin Luther King Day. Here in New York, several protesters were arrested when they refused to leave the lobby of Bank of America. Among those arrested was Occupy for Jobs organizer Larry Holmes. He said he was participating in civil disobedience to honor Dr. King's legacy.
In his latter years, meaning the years before he was assassinated, he became convinced that while the ability to sit in a formerly segregated restaurant was absolutely important, if you didn't have money to buy the food, then you only had gone halfway. And his hope was to launch a new civil rights struggle for the right to a job. And that's absolutely relevant to the depression-level unemployment and underemployment that we have in this city and this country.
In other Occupy news, 6 members of Occupy Baltimore and the Algebra Project were arrested on Monday for trying to occupy the site of a proposed juvenile detention center. And in Michigan, the Reverend Al Sharpton, John Conyers, and religious leaders held a protest on Martin Luther King Day outside the home of Michigan Governor Rick Snyder. They were protesting Michigan's increasing use of the state appointing unelected emergency financial managers to take over management of predominantly black cities and school districts. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.